winter of the blood moon did not arrive with a whisper, but with a suffocating, freezing grip that strangled the ancient pines and entombed the forest in a silence as heavy as stone. Ilara knelt in the deep snow, the bitter wind whipping her dark hair across her eyes and biting at her exposed cheeks like invisible shards of glass. Her breath plumed in the glacial air, a fragile ghost of warmth against the immense, crushing white of the woods that threatened to swallow her whole. Beneath the sprawling, gnarled roots of an ancient oak which looked like the skeletal fingers of the earth itself, a patch of pristine snow was stained, a violent, shocking crimson. There, shivering uncontrollably and panting in shallow gasps, lay a creature of pure, luminescent silver. It was a wolf cub, its hind leg caught tight in the jagged, rust-flaked teeth of an iron snare, and from the impenetrable blackness of the tree line, hidden within the deep shadows where the moonlight could not reach, a pair of eyes, burning like molten gold, watched her every agonizingly slow move. The silence of the forest was absolute, broken only by the shallow, rattling breaths of the injured cub and the frantic, echoing thud of Ilara's own heartbeat in her ears. Ilara did not move immediately. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to flee. To run was to invite the predator that surely lurked nearby. To stay was to risk freezing to death in the rapidly dropping twilight temperatures. Yet, the pathetic, high-pitched whimper that vibrated through the freezing air, a sound of profound, helpless suffering, anchored her leather boots to the ice. The cub was no larger than a hound, its fur a luminous, unnatural shade of silver that seemed to catch and refract the pale moonlight, filtering through the dense, snow-laden canopy above. She stripped off her heavy, water-logged wool mittens, the biting wind instantly turning her knuckles a raw, painful red that ached down to the bone. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered herself fully into the deep snowbank, uncaring that the damp chill immediately seeped through her thick woolen skirts and the linen beneath. "Shh," she breathed, the sound barely carrying over the dry rustle of dead pine needles. "I am not the hunter. I am the healer. I only bring peace." The cub thrashed violently, its jaws snapping at the empty air in blind panic, eyes wide with the primal terror of a wild thing abruptly tethered and trapped. Blood, dark, thick, and horrifyingly bright against the snow, oozed continuously from where the rusted iron bit deep into its silver flesh. The scent of copper was sharp, metallic, and heavy in the cold air, cutting through the clean smell of ozone and frost. Ilara reached into her worn leather satchel, her fingers numb and clumsy but her resolve steady. She bypassed the dried herbs and retrieved a small, heavy iron pry bar she normally used for digging up frozen burdock roots. She purposefully did not look at the dark expanse of the woods. If she had, she would have seen the massive shadow detach itself from the trunk of a great elm, a beast of impossible, nightmarish proportions, its fur as black as the void between stars, moving with a terrifying, silent grace, with agonizing slowness, telegraphing her peaceful intentions. Ilara pressed her bare, warm hand against the cub's heaving flank. The shock of her touch sent a violent spasm through the creature, a ripple of pure fear, but she held firm. She poured all the quiet calm of her spirit into that single point of contact. She matched her breathing to the cub's frantic pants, intentionally slowing her own respiration, forcing her heart rate down until the frantic, terrifying rhythm beneath her palm began to ease into something resembling a steady beat. She slipped the wedge of the pry bar into the brutal mechanism of the trap. The rusted metal groaned, a sickening, scraping shriek against the silence of the woods. The cub whimpered loudly, a sound that tore at something deep and fundamental within Ilara's chest. With one sudden, violent exertion of her core strength, Pushing through the burning ache in her freezing shoulders, she threw her entire body weight onto the bar. The jaws of the trap snapped open with a dull, echoing clack. The cub scrambled backward instantly, dragging its mangled leg, dragging a fresh, devastating trail of red across the pristine white canvas. Elara did not pursue it. Instead, she sat back on her heels and tore a long, thick strip from the hem of her linen undertunic, uncapping a small clay vial of crushed yarrow, comfrey, and pine sap. The potent medicinal scent immediately masked the smell of blood. She held out the cloth, a silent, fragrant offering in the moonlight. The cub hesitated, its small body trembling from shock and cold. The scent of her pine, dried lavender, and the undeniable, vibrant heat of human warmth warred violently with its wild instincts. Slowly, painfully limping on 3 legs, it closed the distance, its nose twitching. Elara wrapped the wound, her fingers moving with practiced, gentle efficiency, feeling the coarse, magical texture of the silver fur and the delicate, bird-like fragility of the bones beneath the torn muscle. When she was finished, pulling the linen tight to staunch the flow, the cub pressed its wet, freezing nose against her cheek, a fleeting, damp caress of gratitude, before turning and vanishing instantly into the impenetrable dark shadows of the thicket. Elara remained on her knees, staring into the dark void where it had disappeared. The fine hairs on the back of her neck suddenly stood rigid. The air pressure seemed to drop precipitously, the silence growing impossibly heavy, expectant, and suffocatingly intimate. She was no longer alone, and the unseen presence lingering just beyond the veil of ancient trees was ancient, lethally powerful, and overwhelmingly masculine. Kaelan did not breathe. He stood perfectly, unnaturally still, his massive, midnight furred form blending so seamlessly into the darkness of the pines that he was nothing more than a trick of the shadows. As the Alpha King of the Aethelgard pack, his life was defined by the absolute unforgiving laws of his ancestors, forged in blood and ice. The law of severance was chief among them, a massive, impenetrable wall of blood and shadow between the magic of the shifter courts and the fleeting, fragile, often destructive lives of humanity. Yet, the scent of her blood spilled from a small, insignificant scratch on her delicate wrist, where the rusted edge of the trap had grazed her, filled his highly attuned senses. It overwhelmed the metallic tang of the trap, the damp rot of the earth, and the sharp bite of the coming blizzard. Her blood smelled like wild honey, ozone, and something inexplicably soft, a scent that completely bypassed his logic and struck directly at the primal core of his being. He had intended to kill her. When he had first heard the metallic snap of the trap echo through the valley, he had raced through the deep snow, his mind a red haze of fury, ready to tear the throat from the poacher who dared touch his sacred bloodline. The silver cub was no ordinary wolf. It was his sister's pup, the future heir to the northern ridge, a creature of immense value. But when Kaelan burst through the tree line, claws extended for the slaughter, he had found not a rugged hunter smelling of cheap ale and musket powder, but a frail human woman. She had eyes the color of a bruised, stormy winter sky, kneeling in the frozen dirt, selflessly offering her own meager warmth and tearing her own garments for a beast that, fully grown, could snap her spine with a single, effortless bite. He watched the steady, calming rise and fall of her shoulders under her heavy cloak. He watched the way her bare, pale hands, trembling violently from the freezing cold that was turning her skin blue, handled the silver fur with a reverence and absolute gentleness he had never, in his centuries of life, seen in a human. Her heartbeat drummed in his highly attuned ears, a steady, rhythmic thump-thump that echoed the ancient, deep earth cadence of the forest itself. There was fear in that rhythm, yes, a sharp spike of terror when she felt his gaze, but underlying the fear was a fierce, unshakable core of courage that utterly fascinated him. Kaelin's massive claws dug into the frozen, unyielding earth, carving deep gouges into the permafrost. His instincts, usually so disciplined, screamed at him to step forward into the moonlight, to claim the space she occupied, to protect her from the elements, to violently dominate any other predator that dared look upon her. The beast within him, a creature of pure dominance and territorial fury, scratched frantically at the confines of his rational mind, completely captivated by the small, fragile creature who had just saved his kin. As Elara finally stood, wrapping her thick, patched cloak tighter around her violently shivering frame, Kaelin shifted his immense weight. The subtle movement was a mistake. A single, frozen dead branch snapped under his heavy paw. The sound was like a thunderous gunshot in the quiet, expectant woods. Elara froze entirely. She did not turn around, but Kaelin saw the way her spine stiffened like a drawn bowstring, the way her breath hitched and held in her throat. She knew he was there. The prey was acutely aware of the apex predator standing mere yards away. But she did not run. She did not scream. Slowly, with a composure that belied the frantic beating of her heart, she picked up her worn satchel, purposefully leaving behind the bloody, rusted trap as a silent message, and began to walk back toward the edge of the woods. Her steps were measured, deliberate, betraying no panic, though he could smell the adrenaline spiking in her veins. Kaelin waited, unmoving, until her honeyed scent began to fade on the rising wind. Then, as silently as a falling shadow, he stepped out of the protective canopy of the trees. He moved to the exact spot where she had knelt. The snow was melted away in 2 perfect depressions from her knees, holding the residual, ghostly heat of her body. He lowered his massive, terrifying head, his golden eyes fixing on a discarded, torn strip of her linen tunic, stained with a single bright drop of her blood. He caught the fabric gently in his teeth. The taste of her essence, salt, iron, and wildflowers set a raging, undeniable fire in his veins that the brutal winter could not possibly touch. He looked toward the direction of her small, retreating footprints filling rapidly with fresh snow. The hunt had irrevocably changed. Elara's cabin sat precariously on the very edge of the wild, a small, stubborn structure of rough-hewn logs and clay, chinking that boldly defied the brutal, sweeping landscape of the northern tundra. Inside, the hearth fire roared, a desperate attempt to push back the creeping frost, casting violent, flickering orange shadows that danced erratically against the wooden walls adorned with bundles of drying herbs. She sat in a worn rocking chair, a heavy, patchwork quilt pulled up tightly to her chin, a cup of bitter willow root tea cooling rapidly in her trembling hands. It had been 3 agonizing days since she found the silver cub by the ancient oak. 3 days, and the phantom heavy weight of that unseen golden gaze still pressed persistently against the back of her neck, raising the hairs on her arms whenever she stepped outside for firewood. She could not shake the unsettling feeling of being actively hunted, yet it was a hunting that felt entirely devoid of malice or bloodlust. It felt, instead, like a tether, an anchor, heavy, possessive, and entirely inescapable, tying her to the deep woods. The winter storm howled furiously outside, a high, mournful shrieking that rattled the frosted window panes within their frames and sent drafts of icy, needle-like air sweeping across the bare floorboards. Elara watched the flames devour a birch log, trying to lose herself in the hypnotic, destructive motion of the fire. She was a healer, an outcast from the superstitious village nestled in the valley below because of her strange, quiet affinity for the wild things of the forest, and her refusal to fear the woods. She was intimately used to isolation. She was accustomed to the deep silence of a solitary life. But this new silence, the heavy, expectant quiet that had followed her home from the tree line, was overwhelmingly loud. It roared in her ears, making sleep a nearly impossible endeavor. Suddenly, a sound cut cleanly through the shrieking wind. It was not a human knock. It was a heavy, deliberate, rhythmic scratch against the thick oak boards of her front door. Ilara's breath caught violently in her throat. She set the tea down blindly, the porcelain clinking sharply against the rough wood of the table, spilling a few drops. Her heart immediately hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She moved silently to the fireplace, her slender fingers wrapping tightly around the smooth, heavy iron of the fire poker, her knuckles turning white. The scratching came again, lower on the door this time, accompanied by a soft, familiar, rumbling whimper. The silver cub. Dropping the heavy iron poker with a clatter, Ilara rushed to the door, her fear temporarily eclipsed by concern, and threw back the heavy iron bolt. The storm blasted instantly into the small room, bringing with it a blinding flurry of white snow that immediately began to melt on her braided rug, killing the ambient heat. Standing on her porch, shivering slightly in the gale but standing firmly on all four paws, was the silver cub. Its leg was still neatly bound in her linen, though dirty now, and it looked up at her with bright, unnervingly intelligent eyes that held no fear. "You," Ilara breathed, dropping immediately to her knees, heedless of the freezing wind rushing into her sanctuary and tearing at her hair. She reached out, running her hand gently over its soft, silver-tipped head. The cub leaned heavily into her touch, a deep, resonant rumble of contentment vibrating in its throat. But as she looked past the animal, the blood drained entirely from her face. The cub was not alone. Ilara looked up, her breath pluming in terror. The darkness beyond the meager shelter of the porch seemed to completely solidify, coalescing into a singular, towering mass. The air grew impossibly thick, suddenly smelling intensely of crushed pine, violent winter storms, and pure, raw, unapologetic power. A figure stepped out of the blizzard and into the very edge of the yellow light cast by her open door. It was not a wolf. It was a man. He was staggeringly, terrifyingly tall, his shoulders broad enough to seemingly eclipse the raging storm behind him. He was draped in a heavy, voluminous cloak of dark wolf fur that looked blacker than a starless night sky. His hair, long, wind-whipped, and untamed, was the color of obsidian, framing a face of aristocratic, brutal perfection. High, sharp cheekbones, a rigid, unyielding jawline, and eyes, the exact, mesmerizing color of molten, liquid gold. They were, unmistakably, the eyes of the beast in the woods. He looked down at her, where she knelt on the floorboards, his expression completely unreadable, a silent titan of the winter, manifesting on her doorstep. He took a single deliberate step forward, his heavy leather boots crunching loudly on the snow-covered porch. The dancing firelight caught the dull glint of a silver circlet resting on his brow, twisted intricately like iron brambles, a brutalist crown. Ilara couldn't move a single muscle. She couldn't draw a breath. The Alpha King, the monster of village nightmares, stood at her threshold, and his golden eyes never left hers as he raised a massive, leather-clad hand to rest upon her doorframe, blocking her only exit. The silence stretching between them was an entity of its own, thick, suffocating, and crackling with an unspoken, terrifying electricity that made the hairs on Ilara's arms stand up. Ilara remained frozen on her knees, one pale hand still resting automatically on the fur of the silver cub, her face tipped up, eyes wide as she looked at the towering man blocking the night. She had heard the gruesome village tales, whispered around hearths in hushed, frightened tones to scare disobedient children, the shifter kings of the deep woods, ruthless killers, unforgiving conquerors, beasts bound by magic older and far bloodier than the foundational stones of the earth. "May I enter?" His voice was a physical phenomenon, a deep, resonant, gravelly rumble that started low in his massive chest and vibrated tangibly through the wooden floorboards beneath Ilara's knees. It was a voice designed to command armies, a voice that could bring the very forest to its knees in submission. Ilara swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry and constricted. The ancient laws of hospitality were sacred in these unforgiving lands, even to the monsters that stalked the woods. To deny shelter in a storm was a curse upon the house. Slowly, her knees shaking, she nodded. She pulled herself to her feet, using the doorframe for support, and stepped back into the cabin, pulling her quilt tighter around her shoulders. Kalen crossed the threshold. As he entered, his immense physical presence seemed to swallow all the available light and air in the small one-room cabin. He had to duck his head significantly to clear the low wooden doorframe. He closed the door behind him with a surprisingly soft, controlled click, instantly shutting out the screaming wind and the whiteout conditions. The sudden, absolute quiet in the room was deafening, making the crackle of the fire sound like roaring thunder. He reached up and unclasped his heavy fur cloak, revealing a tunic of dark, boiled leather underneath, heavily scarred and scored by centuries of battle and time. He moved with a predatory, lethal grace that utterly betrayed his true nature. Despite his size, every step was meticulously calculated, perfectly silent and fluid as water. In his left hand, he held a large, rough burlap sack, the bottom heavy and stained dark with fresh blood. He set it gently, almost reverently, on her small wooden dining table. "Payment," Kalen said, his voice flat, his golden eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she refused to yield. "For the blood and the warmth you gave my kin." Ilara stared at the blood-stained sack, knowing it was likely a fresh, heavy kill venison or boar, prime meat that would easily see her through the harshest, most barren part of the coming winter. "I did not ask for payment," she managed to say, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound authoritative, though she internally cursed herself for the show of weakness. "It was suffering. I only sought to stop the suffering." Kalen took a slow, deliberate step closer. The sheer physical heat radiating from his massive body washed over her, completely overpowering the warmth of her hearth. "You broke a hunter's rusted iron with your bare, fragile hands. Human. You gave your own garments, risking the cold, to staunch his bleeding. The Aethelgard Pact does not forget. We honor our debts in blood and meat." As he spoke, he shifted his weight subtly to his left leg, and for a fraction of a second, Ilara's sharp eyes caught a flinch, a tightening of the corded muscles along his jaw, a slight, protective guarding of his right side beneath the leather. Her deeply ingrained healer's instincts flared instantly, completely overriding her profound, paralyzing fear of the predator. "You are injured," she observed bluntly, her grey eyes darting from his face to the dark, stiff leather over his ribs. Kalen stiffened, his posture instantly becoming defensive and rigid. "It is nothing. A silver graze from the cowards who set the trap in my territory. It will heal. My blood burns it out." "Silver poisons the blood," Ilara countered immediately, her voice losing its tremble and growing firmer. She stepped slightly closer to him, entering his personal space. The silver cub trotted over, sitting obediently beside Ilara's leg and looking up at the towering king, letting out a soft, encouraging whine that seemed to plead with the man. Kalen looked from the silver cub down to the fierce, tiny woman. The absolute law of severance screamed violently in his mind. No contact, no ties, no vulnerability. But as he looked deeply into her storm-grey eyes, seeing not the terror of prey but the stubborn, clinical concern of a healer, the ancient magic that bound him felt suddenly, inexplicably brittle. Slowly, silently, acknowledging a defeat he had never before experienced, His hands went to the heavy leather laces of his tunic. As he pulled the stiff garment over his head, the firelight danced across a broad torso sculpted from dense muscle and centuries of layered scar tissue. Along his lower ribs, an angry, blackened, ragged wound festered. The edges of the torn flesh were laced with the unnatural, glowing, sickly pale sickness of silver poisoning, a rot that was visibly spreading through his veins. Elara moved closer without asking, entirely consumed by the urgent need to heal. She reached out, her small, pale hand hovering just inches from his burning, corrupted skin. She looked up at him, a silent, tense request for permission to touch the king. Kaelin's golden eyes burned fiercely into hers, searching for deceit or hesitation. He found none. He did not pull away. Instead, his massive, calloused hand came up, his scorching fingers gently but firmly wrapping around her fragile wrist, guiding her small hand down to press flat against his chest, right over the thunderous, racing, terrifying beat of his heart. His skin was impossibly, dangerously hot, burning like an open furnace beneath her palm. The stark, shocking contrast between her cold, trembling fingers and his feverish, unnatural heat sent a physical shockwave up Elara's arm, making her gasp softly. Beneath her palm, she felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart, a wild, untamed, primal drumbeat that seemed to magically sync with her own erratic pulse, drawing her into his rhythm. Kaelin stood perfectly still, a statue of muscle and restraint, his eyes squeezed tightly shut, his sharp jaw clenched so tight, the muscle ticked as she clinically examined the blackened, rotting wound on his ribs. "This requires drawing the silver out immediately, before it reaches your heart," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sharp crackle of the hearth fire. "I must open the wound further. It will burn terribly." "I have endured centuries of worse," Kaelin murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that she felt through her hand as much as heard. Elara moved swiftly to her crowded apothecary shelves, her movements swift, practiced, and precise. She ground dried witch hazel, white willow bark for the pain, and purified charcoal into a fine black powder, mixing it aggressively with a sharp-smelling, pungent salve of pine resin. When she returned to the center of the room, Kaelin had seated himself in her rocking chair, filling it entirely, making the sturdy furniture look like a child's toy. His impossibly long legs were stretched out toward the fire, his head thrown back against the wood. She knelt carefully beside him on the hard floor. As she applied the thick, black poultice directly into the raw, corrupted flesh, Kaelin's abdominal muscles went rigid as stone beneath her hands. A low, guttural, distinctly inhuman growl, purely involuntary, and born of pure agony, vibrated deep within his chest, rattling the cups on her table. Elara did not flinch, though her heart pounded. She kept her touch incredibly firm but meticulously gentle, her thumbs ruthlessly working the drawing salve deep into the poisoned, necrotic edges of the wound. The silver reacted to the herbs, hissing faintly, sending a plume of acrid smoke into the air. For Kaelin, the sensation was utterly maddening. He was an alpha. He commanded the brutal winter storms, the feral beasts of the valley, the very blood of the earth. He was intimately accustomed to agonizing pain, to horrific violence, to the cold, untouchable solitude of the crown. But this soft, persistent, agonizingly careful tenderness was entirely foreign. It unraveled him. The smell of her in the closed quarters of the tiny cabin was intoxicating. It was a scent that bypassed all his tactical logic and spoke directly to the primal beast pacing endlessly in the cage of his soul. Every gentle brush of her fingertips against his fevered skin, every soft, focused breath she exhaled against his side, splintered the centuries of protective ice he had built around his heart. They remained in this heavy, intimate silence for hours as the blizzard raged outside, burying the small cabin in deep, impenetrable drifts of snow, sealing them off from the rest of the world. The fire burned down slowly to glowing ruby-red embers, casting a dim, warm light. The silver cub slept soundly, curled into a tight ball on the braided hearth rug. Elara sat exhausted on a small wooden stool beside Kaelan, occasionally dipping a cloth in a bowl of cold water to wipe the fever sweat from his brow and chest as the magic of her herbs fought the silver poison. Sometime deep in the dead of the night, as sheer exhaustion pulled irresistibly at her heavy eyelids and her head nodded, Elara felt a heavy, comforting weight settle over her shoulders. Kaelan had draped his massive, midnight fur cloak over her shivering form. She looked up, startled awake. He was watching her intently. The golden intensity of his eyes, usually so sharp and piercing, had softened considerably in the dim light, looking more like warm honey than molten steel. He reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, his massive fingers gently brushing a stray lock of dark, sweat-dampened hair behind her ear. The touch was impossibly, breathtakingly delicate for a creature capable of such extreme violence. "Why are you not afraid of me, Elara?" he asked, his voice a low, intimate rumble, speaking her name for the first time. The syllables sounded like a sacred vow on his lips. "I am," she whispered truthfully, her voice raspy from exhaustion, leaning ever so slightly, instinctively, into the intoxicating warmth of his large hand. "I am terrified, but fear does not mean we cannot choose to be kind." Kaelan's chest hitched, a sharp intake of breath. He leaned down, his face mere inches from hers, his breath hot and smelling of pine against her lips. The air in the cabin grew incredibly dense, charged with a magnetic, terrifying, undeniable pull that urged her to close the final distance. But before he could brush his lips against hers, a sound violently shattered the intimate silence. A long, bone-chilling, chaotic howl tore through the night outside, not the rhythmic howling of the wind, but a discordant chorus of bloodthirsty, feral voices. It was a direct territorial challenge from a rival pack, and it was agonizingly, dangerously close. Kaelan's eyes snapped to the frosted window, the soft gold instantly hardening back into lethal, murderous steel. The fragile, intimate tranquility of the cabin vanished in an instant, replaced by a suffocating, violent tension that tasted like ozone and impending death. Kaelan was on his feet in a fraction of a second, moving with a terrifying, supernatural speed that literally blurred his massive form. He snatched his dark leather tunic from the floor, throwing it over his broad, muscular frame, the burning agony of the silver-poisoned wound entirely ignored in the wake of the immediate threat. On the hearth, the silver cub awoke instantly, the fur along its spine standing straight up, issuing a low, vibrating, defensive growl toward the heavy wooden door. "Stay here," Kaelan commanded, his voice completely devoid of the hushed softness from mere moments before. It was the absolute voice of the Alpha King, cold, unyielding, authoritative, and utterly terrifying. "Do not open the door. For anyone. Lock the bolt behind me." "Who is it?" Elara asked, her voice trembling as she stood up, her hands gripping the edges of the heavy fur cloak he had wrapped around her like a shield. "The Obsidian Claws. A splinter pack of exiles and murderers. They caught my scent from the blood in the snow. They tracked me here to finish the assassination." Kaelan paused at the door, his large hand resting on the iron latch. He looked back at her over his shoulder, his golden eyes burning with a fierce, terrifyingly possessive fire. "They will not touch this cabin. They will not touch you. This I swear on the blood and bone of my ancestors." Before Elara could reply, before she could beg him to stay inside and hide, he threw open the door and stepped out into the raging, blinding blizzard, shifting mid-stride. It was a horrifying, magnificent sight. Where a titan of a man had stood a second before, a gargantuan, terrifying, dire wolf now leaped into the deep snow. His fur was blacker than the void, his shoulders rippling with lethal, explosive muscle. He let out a deafening roar that shook the snow from the roof of the cabin and rattled Ilara's teeth, a primal challenge that promised absolute, unrelenting death to all who heard it. Ilara ran frantically to the frost-covered window, wiping a small circle clear with her woolen sleeve, her breath fogging the glass as quickly as she cleared it. The storm was a swirling, chaotic vortex of white, but through the breaks in the wind, she could see the shifting shadows, dozens of them, massive, gaunt, grey and brown wolves with starving yellow eyes, circling the clearing around her small cabin in a coordinated ring of death. And in the dead center of the ring was Kalen. He was a terrifying force of nature, a god of violence unleashed from his chains. The rival wolves descended upon him in a chaotic, screaming flurry of snapping fangs and tearing claws. Instantly, the pristine snow rapidly turned a horrifying, vibrant, spreading red. Ilara pressed her pale hand against the freezing glass, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. She watched in horrified awe as Kalen tore brutally through the pack. His massive jaws snapped bone with sickening crunches. His immense weight crushed the life from his enemies, tossing wolves aside like broken dolls. He fought not just for his own survival, but with a desperate, terrifying ferocity, a living barrier of shadow and teeth, to keep the blood-mad pack away from the wooden walls of her home. The minutes stretched into agonizing, unending hours for Ilara, though the brutal melee likely lasted no longer than a few frantic moments. The aggressive howls of the attackers quickly turned into high-pitched shrieks of pain, and then, slowly, into the disorganized sounds of a panicked retreat. The surviving wolves broke off their attack, limping and bleeding, disappearing back into the blinding white of the forest, their tails tucked securely between their legs. In the center of the completely ruined, crimson-stained snow of her front yard, Kalen stood alone. His midnight fur was heavily matted with blood, some his enemies', some undoubtedly his own from fresh wounds. His massive chest heaved with extreme exertion, a low, warning growl still vibrating in his throat. Slowly, the massive beast turned his great head toward the window. Even through the raging storm, the darkness, and the thick glass, Ilara felt the physical impact of his golden gaze pinning her in place. He did not shift back to his human form. He began to walk toward the cabin, his movements incredibly heavy, limping noticeably on his left side where the silver had weakened him. He stopped at the bottom edge of the porch steps, the blizzard swirling around him. Ilara didn't think. She didn't obey his strict command to stay securely locked inside. Acting on pure overriding instinct, she threw open the heavy door, rushing out onto the freezing, wind-swept porch. Kalen looked up at her from the bottom of the steps. The monster, dripping with the hot blood of a dozen enemies, his jaws stained red, eyes wide with the primal, adrenaline-fueled high of the kill, stared up at the fragile, unarmed human girl in her nightclothes. Then, the completely impossible happened. The massive, dire wolf, the terror of the north, slowly lowered its great head, dropping deliberately to its front knees in the blood-stained snow, bowing its head all the way to the toes of her boots, in a gesture of absolute, unyielding, permanent submission. As if commanded by the end of the bloodshed, the storm finally began to break. The shrieking, howling wind died down to a breathless, exhausted whisper through the pines. The pale, fragile light of the winter dawn began to creep slowly over the jagged horizon, painting the devastated, blood-soaked snowfields in beautiful, jarring hues of soft lavender, pale pink, and bruised gold. Ilara stood completely still on the porch, the freezing morning air biting sharply at her pale cheeks, looking down at the massive, lethal beast kneeling submissively in the red snow before her. As the first true light of the sun touched his dark fur, Kaelan shifted. The horrifying, visceral sound of cracking bones and the magical rippling of shadow gave way to the form of the man. He remained on his knees in the freezing, ruined snow, completely naked from the waist up. His torso was a terrifying canvas of fresh, deep, bleeding gashes overlaid on old, faded silver scars. He kept his head bowed low, his chest heaving, his dark, blood-matted hair falling forward to completely obscure his face. Alara stepped off the edge of the wooden porch. The deep snow soaked instantly through her thin indoor leather slippers, the icy wetness biting her skin, but she truly didn't care. She walked directly to him, dropping to her own knees in the cold, blood-stained earth right in front of him, entirely uncaring of the gore ruining her clothes. "Kaelan," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear of the killer before her, but with an overwhelming, consuming tide of profound emotion that she could no longer name or contain. He finally looked up. His golden eyes were entirely stripped of their regal alpha walls. They were raw, exhausted, and devastatingly vulnerable. "I brought death and violence to your peaceful door," he rasped, his deep voice painfully hoarse from the battle roars. "The ancient law of severance demands I leave you immediately, that I wipe your memory of this horrific night, of my existence, to protect the pack from human reprisal, and to protect you from us." "No," Alara said fiercely, the word tearing from her throat. She reached out, placing her small, warm, trembling hands directly onto his blood-smeared, stubble-roughened cheeks. The contrast of her pale, clean skin against his dark, rugged, bloodied features was incredibly stark. "I don't care about your ancient laws. I don't care about the crown or the elders. You are bleeding. You are staying." Kaelan leaned heavily into her small palms, a massive shudder ripping violently through his large frame as if a dam had broken inside him. He reached up, his large, blood-stained hands entirely engulfing hers, holding them tightly against his face, inhaling her scent like a drowning man finding air. "If I stay," he murmured, his breath ghosting hot over her lips, his eyes searching hers frantically, "I claim you. The entire pack will challenge it. The elders will demand my blood, and yours. A human cannot be an alpha's bonded mate. It is a literal death sentence." "Then let them come," Alara breathed, the quiet, submissive village healer vanishing completely, replaced in that moment by a fierce queen, wildly protective of the wounded, powerful king kneeling before her. "I have healed your kin when they were dying. I have drawn the silver from your veins and stitched your wounds. I am not fragile, Kaelan. Do not insult me by treating me as such. I choose this." A dark, incredibly beautiful, feral smile touched the corner of Kaelan's bloody mouth. The beast within him roared in total triumph, a soundless, spiritual explosion of absolute possession and profound, world-shaking love that resonated between them. He pulled her forward fiercely, burying his face deep in the crook of her neck, inhaling the intoxicating scent of wild honey and pine that had become his only reason for breathing. As they embraced in the snow, slowly, silently, the dense tree line surrounding the cabin began to shift. Emerging like ghosts from the deep shadows of the dawn were dozens of massive wolves, the entirety of the Aethelgard pack. They had followed the scent of blood and their king. They stood in absolute silence, a wall of fur and fangs, watching the utterly impossible. Their alpha, the most ruthless, undefeated warrior the North had seen in a millennia, kneeling willingly in the snow, offering his life, his heavy crown, and his very soul to a fragile human girl. Kaelan stood up slowly, groaning slightly as his wounds stretched, pulling Alara up with him. He wrapped his heavy fur cloak securely around her shoulders, shielding her small frame from the biting cold wind and the hundreds of staring, judging eyes of the pack. He turned to face his people, pulling Elara flush against his side, his arm an iron band around her waist. He didn't speak a single word. He didn't need to. The lethal, golden fire reigniting in his eyes dared any single one of them to step forward and challenge his claim on the woman at his side. The silver cub, bandaged leg and all, pushed its way determinedly through the dense front ranks of the pack, limping slightly but walking with a proud, unbroken, regal spirit. It trotted up the wooden steps of the porch, then turned and sat down directly beside Kaelin and Elara, looking out at the pack, aligning itself with the human. A tense, suffocating moment passed. Then, one by one, the massive wolves of Aethelgard lowered their great heads. They did not bow solely to the king they feared. They bowed deeply to the human woman who stood fearlessly beside him, the healer who had tamed the brutal winter itself. Kaelin looked down at Elara, his thumb brushing tenderly along her jawline, wiping away a smear of blood. "The winter is over," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her temple, turning her toward the deep, ancient expanse of the woods that was now her kingdom. The transition from the brutal winter to spring in the mountainous Aethelgard territory was not a slow, gentle melt, but an explosive, vibrant celebration of life conquering death. The suffocating, endless white gave way to vibrant, shocking emerald greens as ferns and moss reclaimed the forest floor. The frozen rivers shattered with sounds like cannon fire, rushing with cold, clear, life-giving water that sang over the smoothed stones. Elara stood quietly on the wide stone balcony of the Alpha's hold, a massive, ancient structure of carved rock and dark timber built seamlessly into the side of a great, overlooking mountain. The wind here was not the biting, malicious gale of the valley, but a warm, gentle breeze, carrying the sweet scent of blooming nightshade, wild jasmine, and damp, rich earth. She wore a beautifully tailored dress of finely spun grey wool, elegantly trimmed in heavy silver thread, a far cry from the ragged, patched linen of the isolated healer's cabin. But securely fastened at her hip, she still proudly carried her small, worn leather satchel of herbs. She was not a pet kept safely in a golden cage. She was the recognized queen of the wild, the pack's chief healer who tended to their wounded, and the undisputed heart of their terrifying king. Far below in the bustling courtyard, the pack sparred, traded, and played loudly in the warm afternoon sun. Among them, easily identifiable by his shining coat, was the silver wolf. He was no longer a helpless cub trapped in iron, but a sleek, dangerous, highly intelligent adolescent who still stubbornly slept at the foot of Elara's large bed every single night, her sworn protector. Suddenly, strong, incredibly heavy arms wrapped securely around her waist from behind. A broad, muscular chest pressed warmly against her back, and Kaelin buried his face deep in her dark hair, inhaling deeply, a content sigh rumbling in his chest. "You are thinking entirely too loudly, little bird," he murmured playfully, his deep, gravelly voice vibrating pleasantly against her spine, sending a shiver down her arms. Elara smiled, leaning back fully against his solid strength, covering his large, heavily scarred hands with her own pale ones. "I am just watching the valley. It looks so completely different without the snow. It's hard to believe how much has changed." Kaelin turned her around gently in his arms, trapping her against the stone balustrade. The golden fire in his eyes was no longer a dangerous threat of violence or a warning, but a steady, burning, eternal devotion that warmed her from the inside out. He wore no shirt, completely unbothered by the cool mountain breeze, showcasing the silver scar on his ribs. It was now completely healed, reduced to a faint, jagged white line, a permanent testament to her magic, her care, and the night they defied the laws of their worlds. "Everything looks different now," he said softly, his rough thumb tracing the delicate line of her cheek, his gaze tracing her features, as if memorizing them for the 1,000th time. You brought the thaw, Ilara, not just to the frozen forest. You brought it to me. You melted the ice in my blood. He kissed her then, a slow, deep, consuming branding that tasted of the wild wind, sunshine, and absolute undeniable permanence. The unique, powerful bond between them, human and shifter, gentle healer and lethal killer, hummed visibly in the air around them, an ancient, thrumming magic far older and vastly stronger than any prejudiced law the ancestors had ever written in blood. Ilara smiled against his lips, pulling him closer by the leather ties of his breeches, her hands tangling deeply in his dark, untamed hair. The fearsome Alpha King had watched her in the dark, intending to be her bloody end. Instead, in the coldest, most brutal heart of the winter, surrounded by death, they had found their beautiful, eternal beginning. In the deep heart of the ancient pines, the impossible legend of the human queen and the Alpha King became a sacred whisper carried on the wind, a story destined to outlast the mountain stones and the winter snows. Together, they proved that true destiny is never written in the cold, inflexible, ancient laws of magic or blood, but rather in the quiet, terrifying, split-second moments of choice. The courageous choice to stay when every instinct says run. The choice to heal the hand that could strike you. The profound choice to bare one's throat willingly to the sharp blade of love. Their bond, fiercely forged in spilled blood, burning fever, and the dim firelight of a solitary cabin, forever shattered the cold isolation of a lonely crown. They successfully bridged two warring worlds meant to be forever severed by fear and prejudice. Ilara brought the warm, forgiving gentleness of the hearth to the wild, and Kaelin, in return, gave her the absolute, untamed, magnificent freedom of the forest. Together, they ruled their vast territory not with the expected iron fist of fear and violence, but with the enduring, quiet, unshakable strength of a bitter winter that has finally, joyously surrendered to the life of spring.